Welcome to Mr. Hutchings' History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey there. So it looks like we've got a pretty hefty stack of sources about the civil rights movement here.
Yeah, someone's definitely looking to go deeper than just the surface level.
Absolutely. They want to really get in the thick of it. And it seems like they want us to really understand this pivotal period in American history.
You got a deep dive into this fight for equality of the U.S.
From the long shadow of slavery to those landmark victories like the Civil Rights Act.
Oh, and the Voting Rights Act. Don't forget that one.
Of course, of course. So much ground to cover.
You're right. There's so much more to it than just, memorizing dates and names.
Right.
We're talking about, a movement fueled by incredible courage, strategic legal battles, and a whole lot of persistence. It's
Yeah, and what's really interesting to me is that it's not just one single narrative we're dealing with here.
exactly. We're going to be weaving together all these different historical perspectives, seeing how they kind of shed light on different facets of the movement.
Okay, I'm hooked. So where do we even begin with the story as complex as this?
Well, like any good detective story, we got to start at the beginning.
Okay.
The legacy of slavery and those broken promises of Reconstruction really lay the foundation for everything that follows.
Right. Because, I mean, slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment,
Right.
and then the 14th and 15th Amendments came along promising equal protection under the law and the right to vote.
Regardless of race.
Yeah, you'd think that would be the end of it, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But it was far from simple.
Okay.
Those historians who really focus on those legal victories, the traditionalist school, they really emphasize how that initial hope for equality, it got crushed pretty quickly.
Oh, how so?
Well, you see, as the federal government started to pull back from Reconstruction in southern states, they took advantage of that.
Oh, I see.
They created what we know as the Jim Crow laws, this whole system of segregation that was basically embedded in their legal codes.
So even though the Constitution said one thing, the reality on the ground was completely different.
Especially in the South, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, these Jim Crow laws, they enforced segregation in every aspect of life. Schools, housing, transportation, even public restrooms and water fountains.
Oh, wow.
It was a system designed to keep black citizens as second-class citizens.
It's just heartbreaking when you think about it, and it kind of makes the Great Migration make more sense, right? Black Americans leaving the South to seek a better life in the North.
Absolutely. The Great Migration was this massive movement of people driven by hope for better opportunities.
Right, makes sense.
But even in the North, true equality, it was still out of reach.
Really? Why?
Well, it wasn't enshrined in law like Jim Crow was, but segregation still existed in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
We call that de facto segregation.
So even if it wasn't like written in the law, discrimination continued through things like housing policies and social customs.
Precisely. And this is where it gets really interesting. Even within the black community, there were different approaches to fighting this discrimination.
How, like what?
Well, you have figures like Booker T. Washington advocating for, economic self-improvement as a path to equality, kind of like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps.
Right.
And then on the other hand, you had organizations like the NAACP. They were focusing on those legal battles to secure civil rights.
So it was like different strategies emerging to fight the same really deep-rooted problem.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder that, movements, they're rarely just one big unified thing.
Yeah,
They're made up of all these different people with their own ideas about the best way to create change.
absolutely. So as we move further into the 20th century, did the fight for civil rights start to gain more momentum?
Oh, absolutely. It was fueled by a whole bunch of different factors.
Yeah.
Labor unions, black newspapers spreading awareness,
Right.
the Harlem Renaissance fostering all this cultural pride, and of course the NAACP's continued legal battles chipping away at segregation in the courts.
So many different threads kind of coming together to create this stronger current of activism.
That's a great way to put it. And here's something else to think about. Black Americans during the World Wars. They were fighting for democracy overseas, right?
Right.
But then they'd come home and face discrimination. You can imagine how that kind of contradiction fueled this sense of urgency.
Yeah, the hypocrisy must have been infuriating.
Absolutely. And, right in the middle of all of this, we see a surprising figure step onto the scene. President Truman.
What, Truman? He wasn't exactly known for being like a champion of racial equality.
You're telling me. But he did some surprising things.
Oh, like what?
Well, despite his own personal prejudices, he ended up pushing for anti-discrimination laws. And get this, he desegregated the armed forces in 1948.
Hold on, I'm actually surprised to hear this. Why would he do that?
Well, it's a question historians still debate today. Some say that he was genuinely moved by the injustice that Black Americans faced, especially after their service in the war.
Makes sense.
Others argue that it was more of a political strategy,
Oh, right.
trying to secure Black votes and maintain a strong military.
Hmm.
Whatever his reasons were, Truman's actions, they had this ripple effect. They weren't a perfect solution, but they set a precedent for future presidents to act on civil rights.
And showed that change was at least possible at the federal level.
Exactly.
Okay, that is starting to paint a more complex picture, for sure.
Yeah.
You've got this legacy of broken promises, then different strategies for change emerging within the Black community.
Right.
And then you have a president with his own prejudices kind of stepping up and taking this unexpected action.
Exactly. And all of that sets the stage for what many consider a turning point in this legal fight for civil rights.
Yeah.
The landmark case of Brown v. Board of Education in 1954.
Ah, Brown v. Board. I remember learning about that in school. Wasn't that the case that finally overturned separate but equal?
You got it. For decades, the NAACP had been chipping away at segregation in the courts, and their efforts culminated in this monumental victory.
Huge.
Remember that separate but equal doctrine? That came from Plessy v. Ferguson way back in 1896.
Right.
It basically legalized segregation for over 50 years.
So Brown v. Board came along and said, nope, separate but equal is inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional.
Pretty straightforward, right?
Seems like it.
Well, in theory, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But there's this group of historians, often called the revisionist school, and they kind of remind us that change on paper doesn't always translate to change in reality.
Good point.
They argue that while Brown v. Board was symbolically powerful, it didn't actually have much immediate impact on the ground.
Wait, really? I mean, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in schools was unconstitutional. So why didn't things change right away?
Well, that's where the messy reality of implementation comes in. You see, the court couldn't really enforce its own ruling, especially when you had all this resistance from southern states.
Ah, I see. So even with this legal victory, there was still this need for something more to actually make integration happen.
Exactly. Brown v. Board was a crucial legal victory, no doubt, but it really highlighted the need for a different kind of action, a movement that could actually force integration on a local level.
So you're saying legal victories are one thing, but actually changing things on the ground often requires something more, like protests.
Exactly. And as we'll see, those protests, they're about to explode onto the national stage.
Okay, now you're killing me with the suspense. But I think we need to take a pause here for now. We've already uncovered so much complexity.
We have.
We've got this legacy of broken promises, different strategies for change within the Black community, a president kind of taking this unexpected action, and then this landmark legal victory that kind of sets the stage for what's to come.
It's a lot to process.
It is. So when we come back, we'll dive into those protests, explore the role of some key figures like Martin Luther King Jr., and see how this fight for civil rights ramps up even further.
Sounds good.
Stay with us.
All right, we're back. And I've got to say, that cliffhanger's got me on the edge of my seat.
Oh, yeah.
You were saying something about protests exploding onto the scene.
Oh, you better believe it. The Brown v. Board decision, it might have been slow to take effect,
Right.
but it did something incredibly important. What's that?
It lit a fire under the movement.
Especially among young people, right?
Especially among young people.
Okay.
Yeah, and 1955
Oh, boy.
throws gasoline on that fire.
Oh, how so?
It's two events that really shook the nation.
Okay.
First, you have the brutal murder of Emmett Till,
Emmett Till.
this 14-year-old Black boy visiting Mississippi from Chicago.
Oh, yeah.
He was accused of whistling at a white woman,
Right.
and the savagery of his killing.
It's hard to even talk about.
It is, and then just a few months later, you have Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus.
I know the name Rosa Parks, of course, but I honestly don't remember a lot of the details. It's one of those things you learn about in school but didn't fully grasp the significance at the time.
Well, her story is so much more than just refusing to move to the back of the bus.
Right.
Parks was a longtime activist.
No, I said.
And her act of defiance, it was deliberate.
Okay.
It sparked the Montgomery bus boycott.
Oh, yes.
This year-long protest where Black citizens just refused to ride the city buses.
They walked.
They walked, they carpooled,
Wow.
whatever it took to make their voices heard.
A whole year. They really held their ground.
They did. And here's where we see a key figure emerge. Martin Luther King Jr.
MLK.
He was a young pastor at the time.
Right?
And the boycott really catapulted him into the national spotlight.
So this is where he kind of becomes the MLK we learn about in history books.
Exactly. The Montgomery bus boycott, it was his trial by fire.
Wow.
His leadership, along with just the incredible resilience of the Black community, it led to a major victory.
They desegregated the buses.
They desegregated the city buses.
Huge win. So this was also a turning point in terms of strategy, right? You were saying it wasn't just about legal battles anymore.
Right. It showed the power of mass mobilization and nonviolent resistance.
Right.
Inspired future campaigns and really shifted the focus towards direct action.
Okay, so things are escalating. The movement is gaining all this momentum, and we're seeing a shift towards direct action on the ground. What about the federal government? Where are they in all of this?
Well, President Eisenhower, who was in office during all of this,
Right.
he was initially reluctant to get directly involved in civil rights issues.
Really? Why?
He saw it as a state and local matter, but certain events, they kind of forced his hand.
You're talking about Little Rock, right? With the Black students trying to integrate Central High School.
Exactly.
I vaguely remember learning about that.
In 1957, these 9 Black students, they became known as the Little Rock Nine.
Right.
They attempted to integrate Central Highs,
Okay.
and they were met with just violent mobs.
Wow.
Outright defiance from the state government.
So what happened?
Well, Eisenhower, despite his initial hesitation, he had to act.
Yeah.
He sent in federal troops to escort those students into the school.
Wow. Federal troops. That's a big deal.
It was a huge deal. It was a turning point.
Yeah.
Historians who emphasize the role of the federal government in these gradual but significant changes.
The continuity school.
Yeah, they often point to Little Rock as a prime example.
Yeah. Makes sense.
It showed that the federal government could and would intervene to protect civil rights even in the face of state resistance.
So Eisenhower, even though he wasn't like a huge champion of civil rights, took action that really changed the course of things.
It did. And those events, along with, continued activism,
Right.
they paved the way for some federal legislation, some important but limited
Oh,
legislation.
no, like what?
You have the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960,
Okay.
which, while they weren't as sweeping as the landmark acts that came later, they established some key precedents for federal involvement.
Such as?
Well, protecting voting rights and investigating civil rights violations, things like that.
So we're seeing this back and forth between the courts, the federal government, and all this activism happening on the ground. It's like everyone's trying to figure out their role in this fight for equality.
That's a great way to put it. It's a dance, a 3-way dance.
Okay. I like that.
And the dance floor, it's about to get a lot more crowded as we head into the 1960s with this wave of student-led activism.
The sit-ins.
You got it.
I remember seeing those pictures in history books. Young people, black and white, sitting at segregated lunch counters, peacefully demanding to be served. Just incredible.
They were incredible, those sit-ins.
Yeah.
They started in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960, and they spread like wildfire across the South.
Oh, wow.
These students, they were putting themselves on the line, facing arrest, facing violence, all for the right to sit at a lunch counter.
I can't even imagine having the courage to do something like that. Just sitting there knowing you could be attacked at any moment.
It was an act of defiance, for sure, but it was also a brilliant strategy.
How so?
It exposed just the absurdity of segregation in a way that legal battles alone couldn't.
Yeah.
And those sit-ins, they led to the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Oh, Sensi.
SNCC, exactly.
Yeah.
This group, they became known for their commitment to direct action and challenging the status quo.
So now we've got the NAACP fighting in the courts, the SCLC organizing protests and boycotts, and now SNCC, this youth-led group focused on direct confrontation. The movement's really starting to diversify its tactics.
That's exactly right. And that's a key takeaway here.
Yeah.
There wasn't just one way to fight for civil rights.
Right.
Each group had its strengths, its own strategies,
Right.
and they often worked together, even if they didn't always agree on the best path forward.
It's a reminder that movements aren't just about the big names and the famous speeches. They're
Yeah.
about everyday people coming together, using whatever tools they have to fight for justice, you know?
Absolutely. And speaking of everyday people, that brings us to the Freedom Rides of 1961.
Ah, yes, the Freedom Rides.
These rides really highlight the bottom-up nature of the movement.
Oh, how so?
Well, this was a campaign organized by the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE.
Sure.
And it was to test Supreme Court rulings that outlawed segregation in interstate travel.
So they're literally riding buses across state lines to challenge segregation.
Yep. And they knew they were risking their lives.
Yeah.
And they faced some brutal attacks.
Like,
White mobs, even law enforcement in some places.
oh, wow.
Buses were firebombed, riders were beaten, and the worst part,
Huh?
it was all broadcast on national television.
Oh, gosh. Those images must have really swayed public opinion.
They did.
Mm.
The Freedom Rides forced the Kennedy administration to take a stronger stance on enforcing desegregation laws,
I see.
and they showed the world just how brutal racism in America really was.
So even though these freedom rides were incredibly dangerous, they also brought the fight for civil rights into people's homes in a way that couldn't be ignored.
You got it.
Yeah.
And that's something that historians who focus on the role of ordinary people in shaping history, social historians,
Right.
they really emphasize at this point. These weren't famous leaders. These weren't politicians.
Right.
These were everyday folks who decided they weren't going to sit back and wait for change to come.
Yeah. Powerful stuff.
They put their bodies on the line.
And in doing so, really helped to change the course of history.
That's exactly.
Wow. Okay. So we've got the courts, the government, and grassroots activists all pushing for change in these really incredible ways.
All coming together.
It is. But I'm sensing things are about to get even more intense.
Oh, yeah.
Am I right?
You are. The next stop on our deep dive takes us to Birmingham, Alabama in 1963.
Birmingham.
This is where the SCLC, led by King, decided to target one of the most notoriously segregated cities in America.
Uh-oh, I can already sense the tension building. What happened in Birmingham?
Well, let's just say they weren't exactly welcomed with open arms.
Okay, before we get to that, I think we need to take a quick break to let all of this sink in. When we come back, we'll unpack the events in Birmingham, explore that iconic March on Washington, and see how the Civil Rights Act of 1964 finally becomes a reality. Stay with us. Okay, we're back and ready to dive into Birmingham, 1963. You were saying things got pretty intense there.
Intense is putting it mildly. The SCLC, under King's leadership, they went to Birmingham with a plan
Okay.
to challenge segregation head-on through peaceful protests and boycotts. They knew it was going to be a tough fight,
Yeah.
but what they encountered was even worse than they anticipated.
So what happened? Tell me everything.
They were met with brutal resistance from Birmingham's public safety commissioner, Bull Connor.
Bull Connor, I've heard that name.
This guy was notorious for his racist views and his willingness to use violence to maintain segregation.
So what did Connor do?
He unleashed the full force of the Birmingham Police and Fire Department on these peaceful protesters.
Oh.
I'm talking police dogs attacking children,
Yeah.
fire hoses blasting people off their feet.
Oh my God.
The images were absolutely horrific. And you know what's crazy?
What?
It was all captured on television cameras and broadcast across the nation.
I can only imagine the outrage that people must have felt seeing those images.
It's a turning point in public opinion. People who had maybe been indifferent to the civil rights struggle, they were suddenly confronted with the brutal reality of segregation.
So in a way, Connor's brutality backfired. It kind of galvanized support for the movement in a way that peaceful protests alone might not have.
Exactly. Sometimes it takes a villain to awaken a hero.
I like that.
And in this case, Connor's actions, they became a rallying cry for change.
Right. It really pushed President Kennedy to take a more forceful stance on civil rights.
It did. And it helped pave the way for the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Okay, so Birmingham was this flashpoint, this moment where the world saw the ugliness of segregation in stark relief. And then you mentioned the March on Washington happened that same year.
That's right. Just a few months after Birmingham, A. Philip Randolph, a longtime labor leader and civil rights activist,
Right.
he organized the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
Okay.
It was this massive demonstration with over 250,000 people marching to demand equal rights and economic opportunities.
And that's where MLK delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech.
Exactly. That speech, it became an anthem for the movement, a powerful articulation of this dream of a just and equal America.
I get chills just thinking about it. It's one of those speeches that transcends time.
It does.
And it still resonates so strongly today.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's important to remember that the March on Washington wasn't just about speeches.
Right.
It was a massive display of interracial solidarity.
Right.
People of all backgrounds coming together to demand change.
So you've got this momentum building from Birmingham, the power of the March on Washington, and this increased pressure on the federal government to act. Is this finally when the Civil Rights Act gets passed?
You got it. In 1964, After a lot of debate and political maneuvering, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson.
LBJ, he had taken office after Kennedy's assassination, right?
That's right.
Okay, so this is a huge victory, right? What did the act actually do?
It was monumental. The act outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin
Wow.
in public accommodations and employment.
Okay.
It also strengthened voting rights and gave the federal government more power to enforce desegregation.
So it basically made those Jim Crow laws illegal on a federal level.
Exactly. It was a major step forward in dismantling the legal framework of segregation.
Okay, I'm noticing a pattern here.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like these legal victories are super important, but they often need that pressure from protests and activism to actually make a difference.
That's a very astute observation.
Mm-hmm.
And while the Civil Rights Act was a landmark achievement, it's important to note that it didn't solve every problem.
Right.
Those historians who challenge traditional narrative,
The critical school.
yeah, they point out that the act, it didn't fully address economic inequality
Oh, right.
or eliminate that de facto segregation that still existed in many parts of the country,
Especially in the North.
especially the North.
So it's like winning a major battle, but not quite winning the war.
That's a good way to put it.
Hmm.
And the fight for voting rights was still far from over.
Right, because even though the Civil Rights Act had some provisions about voting, there were still a lot of obstacles for that. Right?
Exactly. Things like literacy tests, poll taxes, outright intimidation tactics, they were still being used to disenfranchise black voters.
Awful.
So the movement shifted its focus to securing that right to vote, which many saw as the key to achieving full equality.
And this is where Selma, Alabama comes in.
You got it.
No.
In 1965, activists in Selma, led by the SCLC and SNCC,
Okay.
they organized a series of marches to demand voting rights and to protest those brutal tactics being used to suppress black voter registration.
And this is where we see Bloody Sunday, when those peaceful marchers were attacked by state troopers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
It was a shocking display of violence broadcast on national television.
Right, and it really galvanized support for the voting rights movement.
It did.
So just like in Birmingham, this act of brutality backfired on those in power.
Exactly. It put immense pressure on President Johnson to act. And just a few months after Bloody Sunday, he addressed a joint session of Congress,
Okay.
famously declaring "We shall overcome" and introducing the Voting Rights Act.
Wow, this is a big moment. What did the Voting Rights Act actually do?
Well, it outlawed discriminatory voting practices like literacy tests and poll taxes.
Okay.
And it gave the federal government the power to oversee voter registration in areas with a history of discrimination.
So it finally removed those barriers that had been preventing black citizens from exercising their right to vote.
That's right. And the impact was immediate and profound. Black voter registration surged across the South, and black political representation increased dramatically.
So by the mid-1960s, the movement had achieved these incredible victories.
Yeah.
The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, it feels like a real turning point in this fight for equality.
It was a moment of triumph, but it's important to remember that the fight for equality, it didn't end there.
Right, because even though legal segregation was largely dismantled, those issues like de facto segregation, economic inequality, racial bias, they still persist today.
Exactly. And that's why studying the civil rights movement is so important.
It's not just about understanding the past.
It's not. It's about learning from those who fought for justice and using that knowledge to address the challenges we face today.
That's such a powerful message. So where does that leave us? Having explored all these different historical threads, all these different perspectives, what's the big takeaway?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the fight for equality, it's an ongoing process. It requires constant vigilance, this willingness to challenge injustice wherever we see it,
Yeah.
and this commitment to creating a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Well said. And it reminds us that history isn't just a collection of dates and events. It's a story that's still unfolding, and we all have a role to play in shaping its next chapter.
Absolutely. The spirit of the civil rights movement lives on in every act of courage, every voice raised against injustice, every step we take towards a more just and equitable world.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for guiding us on this incredible journey through the civil rights movement. It's been eye-opening, it's been inspiring, and it's definitely given us all a lot to think about. And for those of you listening, I hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to learn even more. This story of the fight for equality is far from over, and it's really up to each of us to carry that torch forward. Thanks for joining us at the SEC.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings' History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.